The morning of February 14th, 1943. "18,000 feet above Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. A Japanese naval aviator lined up his sights on what he assumed would be another routine victory against American fighters. His thumb hovered over the firing button of his Zero's 20mm cannons, 60 rounds per gun, 120 rounds total, 7 seconds of sustained fire if he didn't miss. The American fighter ahead of him began to climb. The Zero pilot smiled. Every American fighter he'd faced over the past year couldn't match his aircraft's legendary maneuverability and climb rate. He pulled back on his stick to follow. Then, something impossible happened. The dark blue American fighter, with its distinctive inverted gull wings, didn't just climb. It accelerated upward past 20,000 feet, then 22,000, still climbing with power to spare while his Zero, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, struggled at its operational ceiling, engine gasping in the thin air. The American fighter didn't slow. It didn't stall. It simply vanished into the sky above him, unreachable. This was the Vought F4U Corsair, and mounted in its wings were 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns. Each gun carried 400 rounds for the inner pair, 375 for the outer weapons. 2,350 rounds total. What the Japanese pilot didn't know, what no Japanese pilot understood that Valentine's Day morning, was that each of those 50 caliber rounds carried more kinetic energy than 8 of his 7.7mm machine gun bullets combined. He didn't know that a single 50 caliber armor-piercing round could penetrate 0.83 inches of hardened steel at 600 feet. He didn't know that his Zero's construction, deliberately stripped of armor to save weight, offered no more protection than rice paper against such ammunition. Within 18 months, the F4U Corsair's overwhelming firepower would psychologically shatter the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service's elite pilot corps through relentless demonstrations of technical superiority that demolished every tactical doctrine Japanese pilots had perfected since 1937. The Corsair wouldn't just shoot down Zeros, it would cut them apart, mid-air, with a volume and power of fire that Japanese pilots had never imagined possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the psychological devastation the Corsair's firepower inflicted, one must first comprehend the supreme confidence of Japanese naval aviators in early 1943. These men were survivors of the world's most selective aviation training program. The Yokoren Naval Aviator Preparatory Course accepted fewer than 2% of applicants. Those selected endured 3 years of training that killed more candidates than the Americans lost in some battles. By 1943, the average Japanese carrier pilot had over 800 hours of flight time. Many veterans of the China campaign had over 2,000 hours. They had revolutionized naval warfare at Pearl Harbor, stunned the British at Ceylon, and dominated the skies from Burma to the Gilberts. In 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M0 achieved a 12-to-1 kill ratio against Allied fighters. Japanese pilots had developed energy tactics that maximized their aircraft's strengths: unmatched maneuverability, exceptional range, excellent visibility. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter, could fly farther than any opponent, and in experienced hands seemed unbeatable, but their confidence rested on a foundation that was about to crumble. The Japanese Navy's fighter doctrine, refined through 6 years of combat in China, emphasized individual skill and aggressive tactics. Their pilots were taught that spiritual superiority, the warrior's Bushido spirit, would overcome material disadvantages. This philosophy had proven correct against Chinese pilots, against British Hurricanes, against American P-40S and F-4F Wildcats. Each victory reinforced their belief that skill and spirit trumped technology and armor. The armament that gave them this confidence seemed adequate. 2 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns mounted in the engine cowling, each with 500 rounds. These weapons, derived from the British Vickers, fired at 750 meters per second with an effective range of 600 meters, reliable, accurate, light, and two Type 99 20mm cannons mounted in the wings, outboard of the landing gear. 60 rounds per gun in drum magazines, 120 rounds total. These weapons packed considerable punch when they hit, each shell weighing 3.4 ounces compared to the machine gun's half-ounce bullets. Japanese pilots used a firing selector switch that let them fire the machine guns first to find range, then trigger the cannons to make the kill. This seemed logical. The light machine guns conserved the precious cannon ammunition for the decisive moment. But this armament philosophy carried fatal flaws that wouldn't become apparent until they faced the Corsair. The 20mm cannons had low muzzle velocity, reducing accuracy against maneuvering targets. They had a low rate of fire, just 520 rounds per minute per gun. With only 60 rounds per cannon, an inexperienced pilot might get 2 bursts before running empty. Even an experienced pilot could manage only 5 or 6 controlled bursts. Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's second highest scoring ace to survive the war with 64 victories, later described the weapon's limitations. Our 20mm cannons were big, heavy, and slow firing. It was extremely hard to hit a moving target. Shooting down an enemy aircraft was like hitting a dragonfly with a rifle. It was never easy to score. Our opponents were tough. The 7.7mm machine guns proved even more problematic. Against the sturdy American aircraft that began appearing in 1942, particularly the F4F Wildcat with its armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, the light machine guns were often ineffective. Japanese pilots reported hitting American aircraft with dozens, sometimes hundreds of rounds without visible effect. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's leading ace with 87 confirmed victories, wrote to his younger brother in February 1943, "The Zero is the perfect weapon, harmonizing with the pilot's spirit like a samurai's sword. The Americans build flying trucks, heavy, clumsy, without soul. They cannot match our unity of man and machine." But Nishizawa and his fellow pilots were about to discover that American industry had solved a problem Japanese designers couldn't imagine: how to mount overwhelming firepower in a fighter without sacrificing performance. How to carry enough ammunition to sustain multiple engagements. How to deliver destructive power that made armor unnecessary, because the enemy would be destroyed before they could shoot back. The Corsairs' arrival in the Solomon Islands initially seemed like just another American attempt to match the Zero through brute force. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF 124, brought the first 12 F4U Corsairs to Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943. Japanese reconnaissance immediately noted the new aircraft's distinctive appearance: the inverted gull wings, the massive 4-bladed propeller, 13 feet 4 inches in diameter, the largest ever fitted to a fighter. The long nose that extended far forward of the cockpit. The first combat encounter came on February 14th, Valentine's Day, when Corsairs escorted PB-4Y1 liberators on a strike against Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. The engagement, later called the Street Valentine's Day Massacre, proved initially disastrous for the Americans. 2 Corsairs, 4 P-42s, 4 P-38s, and 2 liberators were lost. Japanese forces lost 3 Zeros and additional bombers. Tactically, the engagement seemed to validate Japanese confidence. But it revealed something crucial to the few Japanese pilots who survived close encounters with the Corsairs. These new fighters possessed firepower characteristics that fundamentally changed air combat dynamics. The technical specifications that Japanese intelligence gradually assembled on the F4U Corsair revealed a disparity in armament that went beyond simple numbers. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each outer wing panel, mounted to fire outside the propeller arc. No synchronization gear needed. No rate of fire reduction. Each gun capable of 850 rounds per minute, sustained. The ammunition capacity told part of the story. 400 rounds for each inner pair of guns, 375 rounds for the outer pair, 2,350 rounds total. At the gun's combined rate of fire, this gave the Corsair pilot just under 30 seconds of continuous firing time. 30 seconds. The Zero's 20mm cannons would be empty after 7 seconds of sustained fire. The Corsair pilot could fire more than 4 times longer. But the true revelation came when Japanese technical teams examined the .50 caliber ammunition itself. Each round was enormous compared to Japanese weapons. The cartridge measured 5.45 inches long. The bullet alone weighed between 650 and 710 grains, depending on type. Over 1.5 ounces of metal traveling at 2,840 feet per second. The kinetic energy was staggering. Each .50 caliber bullet delivered approximately 13,000 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. By comparison, the Zero's 7.7mm rounds delivered about 1,600 foot-pounds. The .50 caliber round had 8 times the kinetic energy. When 6 of these weapons fired simultaneously, the Corsair delivered 6.9 pounds of metal per second downrange. The Zero's combined armament, both machine guns and cannons firing together, delivered approximately 2.3 pounds per second. The Corsair's weight of fire was 3 times greater, but weight alone didn't tell the complete story. The .50 caliber rounds came in several devastating variants: ball ammunition for general use, tracer rounds for observation of fire, 3 times more brilliant than earlier designs, armor-piercing rounds with tungsten chrome steel cores, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that combined penetration with fire-starting capability. The armor-piercing rounds were particularly devastating. At normal impact, at a range of 600 feet, they could penetrate 0.83 inches of face-hardened armor steel. At 500 yards, they could still punch through 3/4 of an inch of hardened plate. During air combat, with varying angles and distances, typical penetration was still 0.39 to 0.59 inches. The Zero had no armor. None. Not a single plate. The aircraft was deliberately designed to minimize weight, maximizing performance through minimum protection. Every component was lightened, every gram counted, every safety factor reduced. The result was an aircraft that could outturn and outrange any Allied fighter in 1941 and 1942. But against .50 caliber armor-piercing rounds, the Zero might as well have been made of cardboard. The bullets didn't just punch holes. They tore through the thin aluminum skin, through the unprotected fuel tanks, through control cables, through the pilot himself, and out the other side. Sakai later described encountering a Grumman F4F Wildcat early in the war, an aircraft with armor protection but armed with only 4 .50 caliber guns. For some strange reason, even after I had poured about 500 or 600 rounds of ammunition directly into the Grumman, the airplane did not fall but kept on flying. I thought this was very odd. It had never happened before. I closed the distance between the two airplanes until I could almost reach out and touch the Grumman. To my surprise, the Grumman's rudder and tail were torn to shreds, looking like an old torn piece of rag. With his plane in such condition, no wonder the pilot was unable to continue fighting. A Zero which had taken that many bullets would have been a ball of fire by now. The Corsair carried 6 of these weapons. 6, with 50% more ammunition than the Wildcat, and the Corsair's ANM-2 armor-piercing incendiary rounds were specifically designed to set fire to fuel systems while penetrating structure. Japanese pilots who survived their first Corsair encounters reported experiences that shattered their understanding of aerial combat. The Americans didn't engage in traditional turning fights. Instead, they climbed above the Zeros, something no American fighter had previously managed with such ease, and executed high-speed diving attacks. They used their massive speed advantage to escape before Japanese pilots could respond, then zoom climbed back to altitude, completely immune to pursuit. And when they fired, the result wasn't the familiar pattern of tracer rounds and occasional hits. It was destruction. Instant, complete, overwhelming destruction. A Zero caught in a Corsair's gun sight didn't just take damage, it disintegrated. Wings sheared off, fuselages broke apart, fuel tanks exploded in massive fireballs, Control surfaces vanished in clouds of aluminum fragments. Pilots died before they could even react. Their unarmored cockpits no protection against 50 caliber rounds that could penetrate 3/4 of an inch of hardened steel. The Corsairs' ammunition capacity meant American pilots could afford to fire longer bursts than Japanese pilots had ever experienced. A typical Corsair engagement might involve a 2 to 3 second burst, approximately 170 to 250 rounds, all 6 guns fired, 28 to 42 rounds from each weapon, 28 to 42 chances to hit, to penetrate, to destroy. Japanese pilots, conditioned to conserve their limited cannon ammunition, couldn't comprehend such abundance. They were trained to fire short, precise bursts, to make every round count, to break off after expending their 120 cannon rounds, even if their machine gun ammunition remained. American Corsair pilots, by contrast, could fire multiple long bursts in a single engagement and still have ammunition remaining for additional combat. They could afford to be less precise, to fire at longer ranges, to keep firing until the target was destroyed. The psychological impact of this firepower disparity was immediate and profound. Japanese pilots who had entered the war believing in their superiority, technological and spiritual, now faced an enemy who could kill them before they could shoot back, who could fire from ranges they couldn't reach, who could sustain fire long enough to guarantee destruction. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds proved especially terrifying. These ammunition types combined a hardened steel core for penetration with an incendiary compound that ignited on impact. When they struck a Zero's unprotected fuel tank, the result was immediate and catastrophic. The penetrator punched through the thin aluminum tank wall. The incendiary compound ignited the fuel vapor. The entire aircraft became an inferno within seconds. American pilots quickly learned that Zeros were remarkably flammable. A single well-placed burst could set a Zero ablaze. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who became first Corsair ace on May 13, 1943, described typical engagements where Japanese pilots seemed helpless against the Corsairs' firepower advantages. Walsh achieved 21 victories in Corsairs over 6 months. He noted that fighting Zeros became mechanical, climb above them, dive through their formation at speeds they couldn't match, fire a burst, delivering 200 rounds of 50 caliber devastation, zoom climbs to safety using excess energy, repeat. The Japanese couldn't follow the dive, couldn't catch the climb, couldn't survive the firing pass. Rabaul, Japan's fortress in the southwest Pacific, became the proving ground for the Corsairs' systematic application of overwhelming firepower. Here, at Japan's most powerful base outside the home islands, the cream of Japanese fighter units concentrated to stop the American advance. By October 1943, when Major Gregory Pappy Boyington's VMF 214 Black Sheep Squadron arrived with their F4U Corsairs, the psychological balance had already shifted. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Japanese pilots no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of survival. They spoke of avoiding the bent-wing fighters. They spoke of the sound those aircraft made diving from altitude, a distinctive whistling shriek created by the oil cooler intakes in the wing roots, a sound that haunted their dreams, a sound they called whistling death. On December 17, 1943, Boyington led 31 Corsairs as cover for a bombing raid on Rabaul. The Japanese launched 40 Zeros to intercept. Their best pilots, their newest aircraft. The Corsairs climbed to 25,000 feet, altitude where Zeros struggled to maneuver. When the Japanese climbed to engage, the Americans dove through their formation at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour. Each Corsair that passed through the Japanese formation fired. 6 guns, 50 caliber, armor-piercing incendiary, 2-second bursts, 200 rounds, delivered in the time it took a Zero pilot to realize the attack had begun. The Zeros, unable to follow the dive, unable to escape, unable to force close combat, lost 11 aircraft. 2 Corsairs sustained damage. None were shot down. The mathematics of ammunition capacity created strategic advantages Japanese commanders couldn't counter. A Corsair squadron of 12 aircraft carried 28,200 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, 28,000 opportunities to kill. At 6.9 pounds of metal per second per aircraft, 12 Corsairs firing simultaneously delivered over 82 pounds of projectiles downrange every second. A Zero squadron of 12 aircraft carried 7,200 machine gun rounds and 1,440 cannon rounds. Less than one-third the machine gun ammunition. The cannons, even firing together, provided only 98 seconds of sustained fire for the entire squadron before running empty. In prolonged engagements, this disparity became decisive. American pilots could make multiple attack runs. Japanese pilots had to make every burst count, knowing they would run out of cannon ammunition after a few passes. The Americans could afford mistakes. The Japanese could not. The Corsairs' firepower also enabled tactics impossible for Japanese fighters. American pilots developed a technique called the spray. When attacking bomber formations, a Corsair pilot would open fire at extended range, 800 to 1,000 yards, and maintain fire through the entire attack run, walking the stream of bullets onto the target. 200 to 300 rounds expended. 2 to 3 seconds of continuous fire. This technique worked because Corsair pilots had ammunition to spare. A pilot might use 300 rounds, destroying one bomber, and still have 2,050 rounds remaining for fighters. Japanese pilots, conserving their limited cannon ammunition, had to close to 300 yards or less before firing, exposing themselves to defensive fire for longer periods. The psychological terror extended beyond individual engagements. Japanese pilots developed involuntary reactions to the Corsair's distinctive sound, the whistling shriek in a dive, the sound of 650 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously, a roar unlike any weapon they'd encountered. Ground crews at Japanese airfields reported that pilots would flinch at similar sounds, even when no combat was occurring. The Corsair's appearance amplified this psychological warfare. The inverted gull wings created a predatory silhouette unlike any other aircraft. The massive propeller created a brutal, purposeful appearance. The dark blue paint scheme made it nearly invisible against the sea when diving from above. American pilots deliberately enhanced this psychological effect. They would make terror dives without firing, just to create the whistling sound over Japanese airfields. Boyington's Black Sheep squadron painted shark mouths on their Corsairs, enhancing the predatory image. By mid-1943, Japan faced a terrible equation. The Corsair and other advanced American fighters were killing experienced pilots faster than Japan could train replacements, and the ammunition disparity meant each engagement favored the Americans more heavily. Pre-war, Japanese naval aviators received 500 to 700 hours of flight training before combat assignment. By 1943, fuel shortages and training aircraft losses had reduced this to 150 hours. By 1945, new pilots arrived with as little as 40 to 60 hours, barely able to handle their aircraft, let alone fight Corsairs. The psychological impact on veteran pilots was devastating. They were paired with novices, who had no chance against Corsairs with their overwhelming firepower, forced to watch them die while trying to protect them. The traditional mentor system collapsed under the weight of constant losses. Veterans who faced Corsairs in 1943 predicted with horrible accuracy what would happen when American carrier aviation fully deployed the new generation of fighters. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, F-6F Hellcats, sharing the Corsair's 650 caliber gun armament and similar ammunition capacity, demonstrated this prediction's accuracy in what Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Approximately 400 to 450 Japanese aircraft were destroyed versus 130 American planes lost. Many Japanese pilots never even saw their killers, shot down by fighters they couldn't climb to engage or escape from dives. Destroyed by bursts of 50 caliber fire they never saw coming. Killed by the volume of ammunition American fighters carried, ammunition Japanese designers never imagined an enemy could mount in a single-engine fighter. The personal experiences of pilots who faced Corsairs reveal the depth of psychological transformation from confidence to terror. Lieutenant Robert Hansen's extraordinary record demonstrates the Corsairs' firepower advantages. 20 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in just 17 days between January 14th and 30th, 1944. Flying with VMF 215, Hansen exploited the Corsairs' ammunition capacity so effectively that Japanese formations would scatter upon identifying Corsairs approaching. Hansen could afford to fire at multiple targets in a single pass, deliver a burst at 1-0, transition to another target, fire again, continue engaging until either all targets were destroyed or his ammunition ran low. Japanese pilots, conserving their limited cannon rounds, had to commit to single targets and break off after firing. As 1943 progressed into 1944, improved variants of the Corsair widened the firepower gap further. The F4U introduced water injection for combat power increases, better visibility, and improved armor. Same armament, same devastating ammunition capacity, better performance. The F4U appeared in August 1943 with a revolutionary armament change. 4 M2 20mm cannons replaced the 650 caliber machine guns, 120 rounds per gun, 480 rounds total. The cannons fired at 650 rounds per minute per gun. At this rate, the pilot had approximately 11 seconds of sustained fire. 11 seconds, more than the 7 seconds of cannon fire, even though the F4U carried fewer weapons, and the American 20mm cannons were belt-fed, not drum-fed, more reliable, faster reload. No bulges in the wings for drum magazines, but most pilots preferred the 650 caliber configuration. The reasoning was simple. Ammunition capacity. 2,350 rounds of 50 caliber provided 30 seconds of fire. The cannons provided 11 seconds. The 50 caliber weapons were reliable, the cannons sometimes jammed, and the 50 caliber rounds, while individually less powerful than 20mm shells, were fired in such volume that the cumulative effect was devastating. A 2-second burst from 650 caliber guns delivered approximately 42 rounds total. A 2-second burst from 4 20mm cannons delivered approximately 21 shells total. The 50 caliber configuration fired twice as many projectiles, and with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each 50 caliber hit could be fatal to an unarmored Zero. The F4U variant introduced in April 1944 retained the 650 caliber gun configuration but added the ability to carry 4,000 pounds of bombs or 8 5-inch rockets. More than many Japanese bombers, while still outperforming any Japanese fighter, and still carrying 2,350 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, this multi-role capability meant Corsairs could appear anywhere, anytime, in any role. Fighter, fighter-bomber, ground attack, anti-shipping strike, each mission carrying enough ammunition to engage multiple aerial targets if encountered. Japanese pilots never knew whether the Corsairs they spotted were configured for air combat or ground attack. It didn't matter. Both configurations carried the same overwhelming armament. Japanese attempts to counter the Corsairs' firepower revealed their technological desperation. The Zero Model 52 added some armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks in later subvariants, but the added weight reduced maneuverability without providing meaningful protection against 50 caliber fire. The armor, when finally added, was too thin, 5.5 millimeters behind the pilot's seat, not enough to stop 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. The new Kawanishi N1K George fighter showed promise with 4 20mm cannons and better armor. But the weapons had the same low ammunition capacity problem, 60 to 75 rounds per gun depending on variant, 240 to 300 rounds total. Approximately 6 to 8 seconds of sustained fire from all 4 cannons, still less than 1/3 the firing time of a Corsair's 50 caliber guns, and the George suffered from unreliable engines and complex hydraulics that failed constantly. The aircraft spent more time undergoing maintenance than flying combat missions. Meanwhile, Corsairs maintained high readiness rates, simple, reliable radial engines, straightforward hydraulic systems, and ammunition that worked. The deployment of F4U night fighter variants in 1944 added a new dimension of terror. Equipped with APS-4 airborne radar, these 36 specially modified Corsairs hunted Japanese aircraft in darkness, previously Japan's only sanctuary. The night fighters retained standard armament, 650 caliber machine guns, 2,350 rounds. The same devastating firepower, now guided by radar in total darkness. The psychological impact of being hunted in darkness by an invisible predator shattered the last vestiges of Japanese pilot confidence. They could hear the Corsair's engine, the distinctive sound of the Pratt & Whitney R2800. They could sometimes see the muzzle flash when the Corsair fired, 6 brilliant flashes as 50 caliber guns opened up. And then they would die, never having seen their killer. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ultimate psychological defeat came with the adoption of kamikaze tactics in late 1944. This transformation from warriors seeking victory to pilots seeking only meaningful death represented complete acknowledgement of technological defeat. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the kamikaze program, privately admitted the true reason for suicide attacks. Conventional combat against Corsairs and Hellcats had become impossible. By late 1944, the exchange ratio had reached 15-1 in favor of American fighters. The Corsairs' ammunition capacity meant it could engage multiple targets in a single mission. Japanese pilots with 7 seconds of cannon fire had one chance to score hits, miss, and they were defenseless against follow-up attacks. American pilots with 30 seconds of firing time could afford multiple attack runs, multiple bursts, sustained pressure. Rather than die meaninglessly in hopeless combat against overwhelming firepower, Japanese pilots would attempt to die with purpose against ships. The kamikaze program represented the ultimate admission. We cannot match their firepower. We cannot survive their 39 ammunition capacity. We cannot win in aerial combat. All we can do is use our aircraft as manned missiles. American pilots flying Corsairs accumulated victories at rates that would have seemed impossible in 1942. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington scored 22 of his 26 victories in Corsairs in just 84 days. These scores weren't achieved through superior skill alone, but through overwhelming technical advantage. The machine gun ammunition capacity, the armor-piercing incendiary rounds, the ability to fire sustained bursts while Japanese pilots rationed their limited cannon shells. The Japanese recognized this reality. Their best pilots understood that American aces were created by their aircraft's firepower, not just their skill. The machine had become more important than the man. A complete reversal of Japanese fighter doctrine, which emphasized pilot skill and warrior spirit above all else. The Corsair represented American industrial might in its most concentrated form. Vought aircraft produced 12,571 Corsairs during the war, more than Japan's total fighter production from 1942 to 1945. Each Corsair contained 13,000 pounds of aluminum, 1,000 pounds of steel, 18 miles of electrical wire, and 2,000 individual instruments and controls. But the most telling statistic was ammunition production. The United States manufactured billions of 50 caliber rounds during the war. Billions. More 50 caliber ammunition in 1 month than Japan produced in a year. This industrial disparity meant American pilots never worried about ammunition shortages. They could fire freely, engage liberally, and trust that more ammunition would be available. Japanese pilots, by contrast, faced chronic ammunition shortages from mid-1943 onward. Cannon ammunition was particularly scarce. Pilots sometimes flew missions with reduced ammunition loads to save weight and conserve scarce supplies. Some missions were flown with no cannon ammunition at all, only machine gun rounds. The psychological impact of knowing your enemy had unlimited ammunition while you rationed every round was crushing. The Corsairs' transformation into a fighter-bomber in 1944 added another dimension to the firepower story. Carrying bombs, rockets, and napalm, Corsairs could destroy airfields, shipping, and infrastructure with impunity. But they still carried their full complement of 50 caliber ammunition, 2,350 rounds, ready to engage any fighter that challenged them. This multi-role capability meant Corsairs performing ground attack missions remained deadly in air combat. A Japanese pilot spotting Corsairs loaded with bombs might assume they were vulnerable. He would be wrong. Those Corsairs could drop their bombs, and with 2,350 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition remaining, they were still better armed than his Zero with its 60 rounds of cannon ammunition. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace with 64 victories, provided clear assessment of facing Corsairs in his post-war writings. He described recognizing that the war was lost upon encountering the Corsair, not because of one aircraft, but because America could build such aircraft by thousands, each carrying more ammunition than Japanese designers thought possible. Sakai noted that survival against Corsairs required avoiding engagement entirely. When Japanese pilots saw the bent wings, they would dive for the deck, flee to clouds, or do anything to avoid combat. This wasn't cowardice. It was recognition of reality. Fighting a Corsair in a Zero, with 60 rounds of cannon ammunition against 2,350 rounds of 50 caliber, had become suicide. By early 1945, the numbers told a story of complete annihilation based on firepower dominance. Corsairs claimed 2,140 aerial victories against 189 losses in air combat, an 11.3 to 1 ratio. But these statistics understated the psychological devastation caused by the ammunition capacity disparity. Many Japanese aircraft fled without engaging, their pilots having learned that challenging a Corsair meant facing overwhelming firepower they couldn't match. Others were destroyed on the ground by marauding Corsairs that strafed airfields, their 50 caliber guns chewing through parked aircraft with ease. Countless pilots refused to take off when Corsairs were reported in the area. Why die uselessly against an enemy who could fire 10 times longer than you? The final insult came from production statistics. In 1945 alone, America produced 7,829 fighters of all types. Japan managed 1,140, most inferior to designs from 1942. The Corsair production line alone outproduced Japan's entire aviation industry, but more devastating than aircraft production was ammunition production. The United States produced 50 caliber ammunition in quantities that Japanese planners couldn't comprehend. Each Corsair delivered to frontline units came with full ammunition load, 2,350 rounds, and more ammunition was readily available. Pilots could fire freely in training, could fire freely in combat, could expend entire ammunition loads and know they'd be rearmed within hours. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, trained with minimal live-fire exercises to conserve ammunition. Some pilots never fired their weapons in training. They arrived at combat units having never experienced the recoil, the sound, the sight picture of their guns firing. Their first shots in anger were their first shots ever, against enemies who had fired thousands of practice rounds. The Battle of Okinawa, in April to June 1945, provided the Corsairs' final demonstration of firepower superiority. Marine and Navy Corsairs flew from escort carriers and captured airfields, establishing complete air supremacy over the last major Japanese base outside the home islands. The statistics from Okinawa reveal the scale of dominance based on ammunition capacity. Corsairs flew over 15,000 combat sorties. They claimed over 500 aerial victories. They delivered thousands of tons of ordnance. And in each mission, they carried 2,350 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, ready for any aerial threat. Japanese pilots, many with less than 30 hours of flight training, faced systematic destruction. The few survivors described engagements lasting seconds. They never even pointed their guns at the Corsairs that destroyed them. The Americans fired first, fired longer, fired more accurately, and had ammunition remaining after the engagement ended. As Japan prepared for invasion of the home islands, the reality of facing thousands of Corsairs, each carrying enough ammunition to engage multiple targets, created strategic paralysis. Japanese planners calculated that the Americans could deploy over 5,000 Corsairs from carriers and captured airfields. Against this, Japan could muster perhaps 2,000 flyable aircraft of all types, most obsolete, flown by pilots with minimal training, armed with ammunition loads 1/3 to 1/10 that of their opponents. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, later acknowledged that conventional air combat had become impossible. The Corsairs' ammunition capacity alone made traditional fighter combat obsolete for Japanese aviation. How do you fight an enemy who can fire for 30 seconds when you run empty after 7 seconds? How do you attack when every burst from 650 caliber guns could cut your aircraft apart? How do you defend when the enemy has enough ammunition to make multiple attack runs while you must break off after one pass? The answer was, you don't. You hide your aircraft. You save them for suicide attacks, where ammunition capacity doesn't matter because you're not shooting, you're crashing. The Corsairs' overwhelming firepower had made traditional fighter combat, the arena where Japanese pilots had once excelled, impossible. When atomic bombs ended the war in August 1945, they spared Japanese aviation from final annihilation. Plans existed for Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, where over 2,000 Corsairs would have operated from 48 carriers and dozens of captured airfields. Each aircraft carried 2,350 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Combined, these Corsairs would have brought nearly 5 million rounds of 50 caliber devastation to bear on Japanese defenders. Japanese pilots who survived expressed relief at avoiding this final confrontation. It would have been extermination, not combat. One veteran pilot, interviewed decades after the war, described the prospect with stark clarity. They had 600. We had 60 rounds of cannon ammunition. They had over 2,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. We flew aircraft with no armor. They flew aircraft that could absorb tremendous damage. It would not have been a battle. It would have been a massacre. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. In the immediate post-war period, American occupation forces brought Japanese military leaders to see American aircraft factories. The Vought plant in Connecticut, still producing Corsairs, revealed the true scale of American industrial capacity. Single factories produced more aircraft engines than all of Japan. Individual American states had more aluminum production than the entire Japanese empire. Stunned Japanese observers. Most was the ammunition production. Warehouses filled with 50 caliber rounds, millions upon millions of cartridges, armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, ball, more ammunition in one warehouse than Japan had produced during the entire war. The Japanese officers stood in silence, finally understanding the impossibility of their wartime position. They had challenged an industrial superpower with pre-industrial ammunition production capacity. They had sent pilots trained for individual combat, rationing every cannon shell, against mass-produced machines of overwhelming firepower, piloted by men who could fire freely, knowing more ammunition was always available. Former Japanese naval officers observing these production lines finally grasped what their wartime intelligence had failed to convey. The Corsair wasn't just a superior fighter, it was the expression of a nation that could afford to mount 6 heavy machine guns, provide over 2,000 rounds of ammunition, armor the pilot, protect the fuel tanks, and still achieve superior performance. A nation that produced ammunition in such quantities that conserving it wasn't necessary. A nation where pilots trained by firing thousands of practice rounds because ammunition was cheap and abundant. The final statistics of Corsair operations in the Pacific War tell a story of complete domination rooted in firepower superiority. Combat statistics paint the picture clearly. Total Corsairs produced, 12,571. Total aerial victories, 2,140. Air-to-air losses, 189. Kill ratio, 11.3 to 1. Missions flown, over 64,000. Bombs dropped, 15,621 tons. But the ammunition statistics reveal the true disparity. Each Corsair carried 2,350 rounds. At 6 guns firing 850 rounds per minute combined, this provided approximately 30 seconds of sustained fire. Each Zero carried 120 cannon rounds and 1,000 machine gun rounds. At combined rate of fire, approximately 14 seconds total firing time before the cannons were empty and only machine guns remained. The Corsair pilot could fire twice as long, with weapons that delivered 3 times the weight of metal per second, firing ammunition with 8 times the kinetic energy per round, against targets with no armor protection. The mathematical outcome was inevitable. Performance supremacy told part of the story. Speed advantage over Zero, 66 miles per hour. Climb rate advantage, 1,000 plus feet per minute. Diving speed advantage, 140 plus miles per hour. Altitude ceiling advantage, 3,900 feet. But firepower advantage, 530% more weight of fire, 300% greater ammunition capacity in terms of firing duration, 800% more kinetic energy per projectile. Production comparison revealed industrial dominance. Corsairs produced monthly at peak, 418. Japanese fighters monthly, all types, 250. American pilot training hours, 600. Japanese pilot training hours in 1945, 40 to 60. But most telling, American 50 caliber ammunition production per month, tens of millions of rounds. Japanese cannon ammunition production per month, thousands of rounds. Japanese aviation engineers studied captured Corsairs intensively after the war, using them as templates for understanding how far behind Japanese technology had fallen. Every system demonstrated advancement Japan had not imagined possible. But the ammunition capacity impressed them most. The Americans had solved weight distribution problems Japanese designers considered unsolvable. They had mounted 6 heavy weapons with over 2,000 rounds and still achieved superior performance. The lesson was clear. American engineers hadn't accepted the traditional fighter design trade-off between firepower and performance. They had simply built a more powerful engine, strong enough to carry overwhelming armament and still dominate performance metrics. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 produced 2,000 horsepower, more than double the Zero's engine output. This raw power overcame every weight penalty. The Corsair's influence appeared in every post-war Japanese aircraft design. The lessons learned from studying the plane that had terrorized their predecessors shaped Japan's aerospace development for decades. Never again would Japanese fighters carry minimal ammunition loads. Never again would designers sacrifice firepower for marginal performance gains. Never again would pilots face combat knowing their enemy could fire 3 times longer. American Corsair pilots expressed complex emotions about their overwhelming firepower superiority. Many felt combat became execution rather than warfare, particularly in 1945 when facing teenage Japanese pilots in obsolete aircraft carrying minimal ammunition. The Corsair turned air combat into an industrial process. American pilots weren't knights jousting in the sky. They were technicians operating superior machinery with superior weapons and unlimited ammunition. One Corsair pilot, reflecting on his experiences decades later, described the moral weight of such advantage. "I had 6 guns and over 2,000 rounds. My opponents had cannons with 60 rounds that fired slowly. I had armor protection, they had none. I could fire burst after burst. They had to make every shot count. It wasn't combat, it was systematic destruction. We won because we had better tools, more ammunition, and superior support, not because we were better warriors." The Japanese remained committed to their warrior tradition to the end, but faced the reality of inadequate firepower against overwhelming ammunition capacity. Skill and courage meant nothing when your cannons went empty after 7 seconds while your enemy could fire for 30. spirit could not overcome the mathematics of ammunition expenditure. The Corsair proved daily, personally, to thousands of Japanese pilots that their entire worldview was wrong. Spirit could not overcome technology. Will could not defeat industry. Courage meant nothing against overwhelming mechanical superiority, backed by unlimited ammunition. A pilot with 2,350 rounds would defeat a pilot with 120 cannon rounds, regardless of skill, if both pilots were competent. The story of Japanese pilots facing the F4U Corsair's overwhelming firepower is ultimately one of industrial capacity, written in 50 caliber rounds. It demonstrates that in industrial warfare, production lines defeat warrior codes. Ammunition capacity triumphs over individual skill. Engineering backed by unlimited resources defeats courage backed by limited supplies. The Corsair didn't just shoot down Japanese aircraft. It demolished an entire military philosophy through the simple expedient of carrying enough ammunition to engage multiple targets in multiple attacks, while the enemy ran empty after one pass. Every Japanese pilot who faced the Corsair and lived carried the same message. We cannot match this ammunition capacity. We cannot survive this firepower. We cannot win when they can fire 10 times longer than we can. The accumulation of these individual defeats created collective understanding that transcended military failure to become civilizational revelation. Just as German prisoners of war arrived in America expecting weakness and discovering overwhelming industrial might, Japanese pilots entered the war confident in their superiority and discovered they faced not just a superior aircraft, but the concentrated expression of a civilization's industrial power measured in ammunition production. The F4U Corsair stands as a monument to the principle that in modern warfare, firepower multiplied by ammunition capacity multiplied by industrial production equals victory. For Japanese naval aviation, the Corsair was judge, jury, and executioner. It judged their armament inadequate, their ammunition capacity insufficient, and their industrial capability primitive. The psychological journey from supremacy to terror, from confidence to desperation, from tactical innovation to kamikaze attacks, was measured in ammunition expenditure rates. Japanese pilots calculated how many seconds of cannon fire they possessed. 7 seconds. American pilots never needed to calculate because they knew they could fire for 30 seconds or more, and more ammunition was always available. Each meeting with the Corsair stripped away illusions until only naked truth remained. Japan had challenged an industrial superpower with limited ammunition production and lost absolutely. The ammunition capacity difference alone, even ignoring all other factors, made victory impossible. You cannot win aerial combat when your enemy carries enough ammunition to engage you multiple times while you must break off after one pass. Today, restored Corsairs fly at air shows worldwide, their distinctive whistle still evoking memories among those who remember the sound as death's calling card. The 650 caliber machine guns, when fired in demonstration, create a roar that physically vibrates the air. Spectators who hear this sound and see the tracer pattern understand immediately why Japanese pilots feared these weapons. The volume of fire is overwhelming. The sound is terrifying. The visual effect of 6 guns firing simultaneously is apocalyptic, but for those who faced them in combat, the Corsair remains something more, a teacher of harsh truths about industrial capacity, a destroyer of illusions about spiritual superiority, proof that in modern war, the nation with the best ammunition production capacity defeats the nation with the bravest warriors. The Japanese pilots were terrified of the F4U Corsair, not because they were cowards, but because they were rational men who understood they faced overwhelming firepower backed by unlimited ammunition. Their terror was wisdom. The terrible wisdom that comes from counting your 60 rounds of cannon ammunition while watching an enemy with 2,350 rounds of 50 caliber devastation climb into position above you. The wisdom that comes from firing your 7 seconds of cannon fire and missing, knowing the American can fire for 30 seconds and make multiple passes. The wisdom that comes from recognizing everything you believed about warrior spirit and individual skill was meaningless when the enemy had 6 times your ammunition capacity and weapons 8 times more powerful. In the end, the Corsair did what no amount of propaganda could achieve. It made Japanese pilots calculate ammunition expenditure rates before engaging. It made them break off combat not because they were damaged, but because they were out of ammunition while their enemies still had thousands of rounds remaining. It made them afraid to fly, knowing each sortie meant facing opponents who could fire freely while they rationed every shell. And in that fear, in that mathematical calculation of ammunition capacity versus combat effectiveness, lay the seed of Japan's transformation from militaristic empire to peaceful economic power. A transformation purchased with the blood of pilots who learned too late that in modern war, ammunition capacity means everything. That courage alone means nothing when your enemy can fire 3 times longer than you can. That 650 caliber machine guns with 2,350 rounds will defeat 2 20mm cannons with 120 rounds every single time. The F4U Corsair carried enough ammunition to engage multiple enemies in multiple attacks and still return home with rounds remaining. The T-Tape Mitsubishi Zero carried enough ammunition for 1 engagement, perhaps 2 if the pilot was extremely conservative. This single fact, this ammunition capacity disparity, determined the outcome of thousands of aerial battles. The Americans could afford to miss, could afford to fire warning shots, could afford to engage aggressively. The Japanese could afford none of these things. They had to make every shot count because they had so few shots to make. When historians study the Pacific Air War, they focus on performance statistics, kill ratios, pilot training. But the pilots who fought the war knew the truth. The side with more ammunition, delivered by more weapons, with more powerful cartridges, backed by unlimited production, won. Not because they were braver, not because they were more skilled, but because they could fire longer, hit harder, and engage more often. The Japanese pilots never knew, when they first encountered Corsairs on Valentine's Day 1943, that those 6 wing-mounted guns carried 2,000 rounds total. They never knew each 50 caliber bullet delivered 8 times the kinetic energy of their machine gun rounds. They never knew the Americans could fire for 30 seconds while they ran empty after 7. They never knew their cannon's 60 rounds per gun represented 1/10 the firing duration of American weapons. They learned, in the sky over Guadalcanal, over Rabaul, over the Philippines, over Okinawa, they learned. They learned from watching their squadron mates disintegrate under sustained 50 caliber fire. They learned from counting their dwindling ammunition after brief engagements, while Americans still had thousands of rounds remaining. They learned from flying missions with reduced ammunition loads while Americans flew with full loads every sortie. They learned from the terrible mathematics of ammunition expenditure in aerial combat, and what they learned broke them. Not physically, though many died, but psychologically. The realization that no amount of skill, no degree of courage, no depth of warrior spirit could overcome the simple fact that the enemy had more ammunition, more powerful ammunition, more reliable ammunition, and could fire longer, proved spiritually devastating. The Corsairs' 650 caliber machine guns with 2,350 rounds didn't just shoot down Zeros. They shot down the entire philosophical foundation of Japanese military aviation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.